So the last environmental issue that we need to talk about is climate change. And in my view, climate change is probably the biggest environmental issue that we are facing, and it's one that um, you as young adults are going to have to deal with the consequences and help to try to reduce the impacts and reduce our contributions to climate change. So, climate change is basically exactly what it says, that the climate of the earth is changing over time, and it's changing due to human activities. Okay? Um, and what humans are, so if we look at the climate of the earth has changed for a long time. For throughout its history, it's changed. Um, if we look at this graph, which goes back 400,000 years ago, okay, before the Industrial Revolution, before recorded history, well before it, and we can tell actually um, how much carbon dioxide there was, and it has changed. It's gone through these cycles, okay. And if we look at graphs of temperature, we'd see the same thing. Temperature goes up and down. There have been ice ages periodically throughout the Earth's history. So the Earth's climate has changed in the past. However, when we start looking at recent history, what we see is, yes, carbon dioxide levels have gone up and down for hundreds of thousands of years. But then look at the end of this graph. Once we get to modern times, this graph continues upward, getting towards 400 parts per million. Before that point, carbon dioxide levels always got to a high of about 300 parts per million. But obviously, we've gone well beyond that, and the reason for that is because we have been burning fossil fuels at a very fast rate for the last 170 years or so. Okay, um, since the Industrial Revolution, humans have been mining fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas from the earth and using those fossil fuels to generate electricity, to power cars, to heat the homes and businesses, to air condition things. And so burning of those fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide into the air. And when carbon dioxide increases in the atmosphere, it leads to the temperature of the earth getting warmer. And so we can see that in this graph. It happens because of something that's called the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is that as we increase the amount of carbon dioxide, it's kind of like putting more blankets around the earth. Carbon dioxide traps heat close to the Earth's surface, causing it to get warmer. Just like in bed, you put more blankets on you, it traps your own body heat in, preventing it from escaping, and it keeps you warm. Basically, the same kind of thing is happening in the Earth. The Earth's surface is warming up because we are increasing the number of blankets around the planet by adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Out of the way that this works is that obviously the energy on Earth comes from the sun. The Earth's energy shines on the sun's energy shines onto the Earth, okay, and then it's absorbed at the ground, and then it's released. It's re-radiated back into space as heat. But carbon dioxide traps that heat into the Earth's surface, leading to it getting warmer. So how much is the Earth warming? How much has the Earth warmed? Well, we have many different measurements that we've taken that show us the heating of the Earth, and we have ways of predicting future warming as well. So this graph shows how much warmer the Earth is, okay, over the since the Industrial Revolution, basically. We could look at the red line is probably the best to look at. What we see, 0 would be about average. And before the Industrial Revolution, the Earth was relatively cool, below average. Okay. What we see is once we get into the 20th century, we see this temperature starting to rise, okay, increasing, going through ups and downs, but continually increasing. We are at the highest point here at this graph now. And you may hear this each year that people say, well, this 2020 was the warmest year on record. And they say that for almost every year in the last 20 years. Each year, we are breaking records in terms of our temperature, okay, on the Earth as a whole. And you guys are pretty young. Your parents probably recognize this. Maybe your parents say this. They say, well, back when I was a kid, we used to get, 2 feet of snow every December. It was way colder when I was a kid. I walked to school uphill both ways, and it was negative 40 degrees, and I have to wear sandwich bags on my feet. So people that are older probably have a little bit better perspective on this than you guys because you haven't been alive for that long. But the Earth is getting warmer. Predictions vary. So predictions about how much warmer the Earth can continue to get are between 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100 up to over 6 degrees Celsius. That's 2 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a lot. Doesn't sound like big numbers, but that is a lot. And how much that's going to change depends on our actions, right? Whether or not we reduce our carbon dioxide emissions will determine how much warmer the Earth's going to get. It's going to get warmer, definitely. That's already sort of because of past emissions. But as we move forward, what are we doing? Are we controlling our emissions? Are we decreasing them? Are we decreasing them drastically? Or are we just continuing sort of business as usual? And the answer to those questions determines how much warmer the Earth is going to get. Predictions vary, and they vary in different parts of the world. Yes, the Earth as a whole is going to be getting warmer, but it depends on where that is. It can be worse, or it could be less extreme. If we look at this graph in the top right, the darker reddish colors represent where there's going to be greater changes. We see at the poles, those are the darkest areas. That's where the effects of climate change are going to be felt most intensely. These lines on this graph show the projections about what's going to happen. Do we make significant changes to our lifestyles and reduce carbon dioxide emissions? Then maybe we follow these blue lines and we keep the warming of the Earth to 2 degrees Celsius or less. Or we don't change anything and we keep going as we are. And then we probably follow a line such as this red one with an increase of 6 degrees Celsius. The most recent research tells us that we have to make drastic changes in the coming years if we want to keep this from being a complete catastrophe. Okay, if we want to prevent the Earth from extreme warming, which could have serious impacts. And you may have heard of the Paris Accord, which was an agreement that various countries came up with to limit their carbon dioxide emissions. That countries that signed on to this Paris Treaty were going to try to limit their carbon emissions to keep the warming to 2 degrees Celsius or less. and many countries signed on, including the United States. However, 4 years ago, um, the U.S. pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords. Um, there are ideas that after January 20th, we may re-enter those agreements to try to limit our carbon dioxide emissions. Um, and so, what happens? So, yeah, climate's changing. So what if it's a little warmer, right? So don't you want it a little warmer sometimes when it's freezing out? Yeah, of course. But the effects of climate change are wide-reaching and are dramatic. As the Earth gets warmer, one of the effects of that is that glaciers and sea ice melt. Obviously, we saw in that map earlier, the poles will see some of the most warming. As they warm, that ice that's on top of the Arctic Circle and Antarctica starts to melt. And that water from those glaciers goes into the oceans. Also, as the oceans get warmer, they expand like any object expands when heated. What that does is it leads to sea level rise. If we look at this diagram, this shows we can actually measure sea level rise. We can see this black line represents sea level since 1880, and it's been increasing, and it will continue to increase. Down here, this map shows us sea ice, the ice that's found around the Arctic Circle. In 1950, you can see these white areas, the North Pole, were all sea ice. If we look at predictions for the next 30 years, that sea ice is drastically reduced, or there will be open ocean at the North Pole. And so when sea level rises, obviously that leads to flooding. Any areas on the coastline could potentially flood. And that's a major problem for cities, communities that are on the coast. I don't know if you've ever been to Florida, for example. Florida is obviously almost all coastline. And if you've ever been to Florida and you think about when you're driving around or whatever, it's very flat, right? It's not like there's big mountains in Florida. And what that means is a small change in sea level can flood a very large area, right? Because there's not a lot of change in elevation. If you think about island nations, like Indonesia, which is this whole series of small islands in Southeast Asia, increased sea level is really dangerous for those countries because they're island nations. Okay? They're dominated by coastline and they can flood as sea level increases. Also, however, as sea level increases and oceans warm, the temperature of the ocean is what provides energy to storms. And so as the oceans warm, that's going to increase the intensity of tropical storms and hurricanes, and they're going to become more intense. Also, as water becomes warmer, it can hold less oxygen, which impacts aquatic organisms. Species that live in a certain ecosystem, as that ecosystem warms through climate change, may no longer be able to survive in those areas. They may have to either migrate or become extinct. Okay? Ecosystems will be shifting northward, and we've already seen that. Where we have, the temperate deciduous forest, which we talked about the other day in our area, that's going to move northward as the earth warms, into the Adirondacks, into Canada. Migration patterns of birds and other animals, they've evolved because of seasonal changes in the weather. And as the climate changes, those migration patterns no longer are going to work for species. Species would move from one place to another to obtain food or to reproduce. And as the climate shifts, those patterns are going to change. We have drier conditions in many places, which is going to increase forest fires. Um, Glaciers today, we see, are about half of the size they once were. And as glaciers melt and turn into water, they're less reflective, which means they can absorb more of the sun's energy, which increases melting, which reduces ice, which increases warming. And so we have this positive feedback loop where the melting glaciers lead to more warming, which melts the glaciers, which leads to more warming, etc. So a lot of very dangerous consequences can come about due to these changes. It affects humans as well, right? Where we grow various crops depends on the climate of those areas. As the climate changes, those agricultural areas change. We have built barriers to flooding, like in New Orleans, for example, which lies basically below sea level. We have built barriers so that the waters don't flood the city constantly. Well, as sea level increases, those barriers are no longer going to be enough. Hurricanes are going to become worse. As people that live in sort of marginal, dry, warm areas, as those areas go through drought or heating, those people are going to have to find other places to live because they're no longer going to be suitable for habitation. And those people will have to find places to live. As we have less snow, we have less snowpack, we have more drought, we have less water available for irrigation or for drinking. Climate change also has health implications. As the earth is warmer and there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that leads to more pollen being produced by flowers and plants, which leads to more allergies and asthma. There's increased heat waves, which can lead to death because of extreme temperature. In 2003, there was an extreme heat wave in Europe, and it killed 30,000 people in Europe that summer. And those sorts of events could become more common. So obviously, that's lots of bad news. And I don't mean to be like depressing and sad, but that is the reality. That if we don't make significant changes, these things will happen. So what do we do? How do we address these environmental problems we've been talking about? Well, there's lots of things. Okay, some we can do as individuals, some we have to do as states or governments or countries or as the earth as a whole. Population growth we talked about as kind of a root cause of many of these environmental issues. So if we control our population, if we reduce our population growth, then we could start to reduce these impacts. We could try to conserve the resources we have by reducing our use of disposable products, reusing things, recycling materials that we can't use. Those are steps we can take. We could try to control pollution by, using more efficient vehicles, using more efficient appliances, okay, reducing our reliance on fossil fuels in many different ways, increasing our use of renewable resources rather than non-renewables. There are government actions that can take place, like taxes on carbon, in which you have to pay more the more carbon dioxide you're emitting as a company, as an industry. We have ways of protecting species from extinction, such as providing refuges, providing laws that reduce the ability of people to impact habitats where you have endangered species. There are lots of laws that have been enacted over the last 50 or 60 years that have helped try to protect some of these resources we have, like our air and our water and so forth. And so laws and legislation can do a part. But we have to have elected officials that support that. We have to have elected officials that are willing to support the regulation of pollution, that are willing to support reducing our carbon dioxide and our reliance on fossil fuels. And so by electing people that are more willing to take those actions, we can help to reduce these problems. We can get together as countries throughout the nation. We have examples of that. We talked about Montreal Protocol, which limited CFC production and helped stop the destruction of the ozone layer. There are similar kinds of agreements between countries for carbon dioxide, like the Paris Accord that we talked about. And hopefully the United States is going to get back into the Paris Accord in the coming months, so that we can rejoin efforts that countries around the world are taking to try to address climate change. And we can think about, in our communities, think about the environmental consequences of our actions, both personally as what we do and the actions we take, the resources we use, but also as a community, as a state, as a town, as a country. We can try to start to consider the environmental consequences that come along with our actions that we take. And so those are things that you as young people are going to have to think about. And that you are going to, if these are issues you have concerns of, then it's going to be up to you as you get older to study these problems in college, and maybe think about entering fields which address environmental science. And that could be lots of different ways. Some people want to be engineers, which come up with ways of addressing some of these problems. Some people go into politics and help to make policies. Some people go into sciences where they study these issues. There are lots of different ways that you can use your interest in environmentalism to find a educational or career pathway that helps you to make a difference and helps you to learn more about how we can address these problems. Any questions about climate change or any of these other issues we just talked about?